Why your photos are never sharp. This is a YouTube video we've seen time and time again, and in my personal opinion, all these videos are wrong, including the one that I made years ago on this channel. And the reason why these videos are incorrect is because they do not paint a complete picture of how to achieve sharpness in your photography. So today, we're gonna go through every single reason why your photos might not be sharp. This is probably gonna be an overly complicated, comprehensive breakdown, but I wanna make sure everyone has the answer that they're looking for. And then at the end of the video, I'm gonna give you the key concept you need to tie all this in together and achieve the sharpest photos you possibly can. A lot of work went into this video, so if you enjoyed, hit the thumbs up button, subscribe if you are not yet, and thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring today's video. We'll talk about them a little bit later on. Let's get out of this office because I've been down here way too much finishing my new book. I actually just sent it off the printer. So excited to get that proof in, but we'll talk about that later on in another video. Let's talk about sharpness today and how you can get the sharpest photos possible. Now, the first reason your photos might not be sharp is something that affected me 5 minutes ago when I was recording this video, and that is environmental factors. Now, everyone knows if you get water, sand, dirt on the front element of your lens, you're going to have a bad image. But what a lot of people overlook is changes in the environment that you're using your camera gear in. The biggest one being going from air conditioned to humid environments. So earlier, before I recorded this clip, I had a lens on my camera that was in my ice cold air conditioned office all day. And as soon as I brought it to this humid environment, it fogged up and condensation formed on the front element. I'm not a scientist. I don't know what causes that. Now, the way you avoid this is if you know you're going from a cold to warm environment, leave your gear in your bag and let it acclimate and give it time to adjust to the change in temperature and change in humidity. So when you bring it out of the bag, that condensation doesn't form. Now, the second reason your photos are not sharp is the most basic beginner reason, and that is you're not prioritizing your shutter speed. Everyone knows that if you're making a portrait and you have your shutter speed too low, you might capture some movement in your subject, even if it's subtle. You can see that in these example photos of Alec. One of these was made at a shutter speed that was slightly too low, and the other is made at a perfect shutter speed. One has nice clean details, the other is just slightly off. You really have to zoom in to see it, but this slightly offness, this slight error in the photo is affecting the sharpness, even though it's not obvious. So you want to pay attention to these fine details. Now, here's the thing though, photography is cerebral. You have to use your brain, and this is very important and something that a lot of people overlook. Those photos of Alec, those are very controlled environments. I can tell Alec to stay still. I can control my subject because it's a portrait. And in those situations, you can get away with having a shutter speed that essentially matches the focal length on your camera. So for example, if you're shooting at 35mm, you have a nice static subject, you're holding your camera with your hands, you can probably get away with 1/30th of a second at your absolute lowest. I'd recommend going higher, but that rule only works with static subjects when you are in control. If you find yourself in a situation where you don't have control as a photographer and you see a lot of motion happening in your frame, you have to be conscious of that motion and make sure you have a shutter speed that captures that motion effectively. Look at this example right here. It's slightly blurry and not sharp because I did not have my shutter speed high enough to capture this insanely powerful ocean wave that was happening in front of me. But the third reason your photos might not be sharp is because you had to raise your ISO to levels that introduce noise and grain into your image so you can get a shutter speed that is optimum for the image you're trying to make. Now, here's the thing. Most cameras today, the ISO control is very good. Unless you're pushing your camera to the absolute limit, you're probably going to get an image that is okay. Look at these two examples right here I shot with Alec. Without labeling them, you probably can't tell which one is made with the high ISO and which one is made with the lower one. But there is a caveat to this. If you're using high ISOs, you do want to avoid cropping your images because as you crop that high ISO image, it's going to be more apparent that noise and grain that was introduced from you using that high ISO. Okay, so this is where photography gets fun. Remember, sharpness is cerebral. You have to take the situation that you are in, assess the situation and the desired result, and then set your camera accordingly to the result you're looking to get from that particular scene. And that leads to the fourth reason your photos might not be sharp, and that is because your aperture is not set to the desired result you want to get. Now, here's how this works. Your aperture has a relationship to the depth of field you can achieve in a particular image. Think of it like this. If you're you're using an aperture of f1.8, your depth of field is going to be very small. With a small depth of field, you can only capture so much of your scene because only so much will be in focus. If you shoot at something like f8, you're going to have a larger depth of field and you're going to be able to capture more detail and achieve a sharper image. So this is a critical part of this video, and it's why we're back in the studio so I can make sure I explain it properly. Achieving sharpness in your photography is a delicate balance of you understanding all the settings that go on in your camera. It's balancing your aperture to achieve the result you want and having a shutter speed that's fast enough to capture the motion and detail in your image, and also have an ISO that's optimal to achieve the best result based on the camera you're using. So you as a photographer have to assess the opportunity costs based on all these different settings, and this is where things can get a little bit complicated, especially if you're a beginner, and the best way to learn this is just to go out and make bad pictures and learn from your mistakes. But here's an example of what I'm talking about. Let's say you are in a situation where you want to capture a lot of detail in your image. We already talked about how your aperture affects your depth of field. So if you want to capture a lot of detail, you might push your aperture to something like f4 or f6. That's a good aperture to optimize your lens and get more detail because your depth of field is larger. Now in this scenario, let's say there's little to no motion. So a shutter speed of 1/100th of a second should be completely fine for us. The last setting we need to assess now is our ISO. Now in the perfect lighting conditions, we don't have to worry about our ISO to achieve these optimal settings, because an ISO of 200 or 400, maybe 800 will be completely fine at f4 or f6 to get us the shutter speed we need to have a sharp image. But let's say we're in a situation where the lighting is poor. We now have to assess this situation and figure out which opportunity cost we are willing to accept as a photographer. Are we going to raise our ISO to get our shutter speed to the point it needs to be and potentially have digital noise introduced to our photo? Or are we going to drop our aperture lower to get that higher shutter speed and have our ISO lower? By dropping our aperture, we might not get as much depth of field, so we'll have to pay attention to our focus more. That is the game of photography, is finding the perfect balance of all these settings and understanding how all these settings affect your photo. Now, speaking of depth of field, one more thing you have to understand about depth of field is knowing that the focal length you use on your camera can dictate the amount of depth of field you have. So when you're shooting at 24 millimeters, you have a much wider depth of field at a lower aperture. So let's say you're shooting at f4 or f2.8. At 24 millimeters, a lot of your scene will be in focus. But when you go up to something like 70 millimeters at 2.8, you now have a much smaller depth of field. So choosing your focal length also plays a part in the amount of focus you can achieve. A lower focal length will always have a larger depth of field. That's the reason why when you shoot a landscape at, say, 14 millimeters, it's pretty easy to get most of the scene in focus. But when you're using a lens like 70 millimeters or a telephoto and you're shooting a landscape, you might have to stack your focus and focus on multiple different pieces of the image and put it together in post. That's because the depth of field at these higher focal lengths is much smaller than it is when the camera is at a wide focal length. You still with me? There's one more thing we have to go over when it comes to depth of field and focus, and that is making sure your camera's focus settings are optimized to the certain situation you're in to achieve a sharp photo, being the result we're going for in today's video. Now, here's what I mean by this. Every camera has different focus settings. Some have continuous autofocus that's better than single. Some people like single autofocus. Some people like face and body detection. Some people like zone. Some people like field. Some people like single point. There's so many different options. It's up to you to decide what you like and what works best with your camera you're using. For example, my Leica SL2 has terrible face detection autofocus. I hate using it because a lot of times it focuses on people's shoulders or the side of their face instead of their eye, so I avoid it. Now, if I was in a situation where I was capturing a portrait at a low aperture, my depth of field would be very small. So to compensate for this, I would take control of focus into my own hands by setting my camera to single point autofocus. And then I would move that single point right on my subject's eye to make sure the eye is in focus. Because when it comes to those small depths of fields, it's very important to make sure the proper element of your image is in focus. And by setting your focus settings properly on your camera, you can achieve that regardless regardless of the situation you're in. So before we go more in depth on sharpness, I want to thank today's sponsor, Squarespace. If you're a photographer looking to grow your business, one of the easiest ways to do that is with a professional website, and no one makes it as simple as Squarespace. I built my site, evanramp.com, in one day using their drag and drop templates, and now I have the ability to connect with potential clients, sell my prints and presets, and my upcoming book, and also capture an email list. And I recently posted a video breaking down the strategy I use to generate passive income on my Squarespace site from Instagram traffic. I'll go ahead and link that in the description down below. I also have videos breaking down how to build a website to sell digital products like presets so you can start achieving passive income as a photographer. I'll link that in the description down below. And my favorite part about those tutorials and using Squarespace is the fact that I was able to figure all that out with no web design experience. So if you're looking for an easy website solution to grow your photography business, head to squarespace.com/evanramp to start a free trial, and you can watch one of those tutorials, and when you're ready to sign up, you can use code evanramp at checkout to save 10%. That's squarespace.com/evanramp to start a free trial. Follow one of those tutorials linked down below, and when you're ready to sign up, you use code evanramp to save 10% at checkout. Thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring today's video. Now, we just got done breaking down why choosing an aperture that gives you the depth of field you want can result in sharper photos, but something that a lot of people overlook when it comes to sharpness is simply the limitations to the equipment that you're using. That is number 5. The reason your photos may not be sharp is simply because the lens you're using isn't the sharpest lens. One of the best examples I have of this is my 24-70 versus my 85mm prime. I'm very aware that this lens, while versatile and very convenient, does give up some sharpness compared to this prime. Regardless of what aperture I'm using with this prime lens, I'm going to get a sharper photo than this zoom, which makes sense because zoom lenses have a bunch of moving parts, so a sharp image is much more difficult to come by. Not to say these photos are bad, but if sharpness is my goal, using an 85 prime makes more sense. So it's important for you as a photographer to simply understand the equipment you're using and figure out which lens yields the best result for the situation you're in, given the variety of variables that can be present. There's a lot of situations where I'm willing to sacrifice the sharpness that I could get from my 85 and use this 24-70 simply because it's convenient and covers a wide range of focal lengths, where this is simply set to 85. Now, speaking of equipment, there are 3 main user errors that occur when you're using a tripod that would dramatically decrease the sharpness of your photos. The first should be pretty obvious, and that is having your tripod on unstable ground. If you are photographing a waterfall or the beach or anything where there might be some settling happening underneath your tripod, you want to just make sure that it is not moving at all. There's no changes to the ground it's on. Pretty obvious. But things that are less obvious, one is if you are using a tripod to activate the shutter on your photo, by clicking that button you can get micro shake in your camera. So what I recommend is, if you want the sharpest photo possible, you want to have some type of timer set on your camera. This can be an interval timer or the classic countdown 2 seconds like you did on your family portrait back in 1992. Doesn't matter, just have some sort of timer or a remote trigger connected to your camera, so when you press that button or activate the shutter, there is no shake or lag from that motion of you pressing the button. Now, the final mistake that can happen actually is if you are shooting in portrait. So when you have the camera in portrait, as you can see, there is a lot of weight simply on this mount right here, and what typically happens is the weight of the lens you're using, if it's heavy, will drag the camera down even slightly, resulting in motion in your photo, especially on long exposures. So if you want to avoid that, you want to get some type of L bracket for your camera to distribute that weight and have a stronger connection to your tripod to avoid that small lag caused by, of course, gravity. All right, so now you made it back to your computer. You have all these photos you spent so much time creating in the field and perfecting. Now we're gonna talk about the mistakes that you're making in editing to diminish the sharpness of your photos. The first is pretty simple, and that is introducing noise in your edit. You do this by bringing your shadows or your exposure up too much. Now, most digital files today, they're pretty good at this. They have a lot of dynamic range and you can get away with pretty heavy edits. But the minute you see any type of artifacting or or grain entering your photo, it probably means you're pushing the edit too far. And in my personal opinion, a rule of thumb I go by is if I have to edit a photo to the point to where it's breaking down, I need to do better in camera, and I should just take it as a loss and try the photo again. Now, some other mistakes people make is adding too much sharpness with the sharpness sliders. Now, the way you avoid this is by pressing Option on your keyboard and getting a sharpness mask. This allows you to see which edges of your photo will be sharpened digitally in post, so you can only sharpen the elements that are necessary. A lot of times you might slide that sharpness and detail slider up, and you're going to be sharpening things like the sky or unnecessary elements that are just going to add noise and grain into your photo. By using the masking tool, you eliminate that and you only sharpen what's necessary. And the last error that people make when it comes to editing is actually their export settings. So if you are using Adobe Lightroom, you want to make sure your resolution is set to 300. You want to make sure your photo is not being resized to fit anything. And if you want to limit your file size, you can, but I don't recommend limiting it too much. I like to go around 5,000K, 6,000K, and that seems to work really well for social media. If I'm printing a photo, I make sure to turn that off and export the photo at full size with quality being listed at 100. Those are the main things you have to look out for in exporting, and if you're using any apps, check how the photos are exporting in that app and make sure they're not being resized or compressed. Now, speaking of compression, another mistake that can happen to affect the sharpness of your photos is transfer errors. So a lot of times people will send photos over text message or over email. Now, it depends on the situation, but a lot of times these transfers will affect the quality of the image. So you want to make sure you're paying attention to how your files are transferred. If you're using iCloud, you want to make sure your iCloud setting is not set to optimal. You want to make sure you keep the full size original image. If you're sending files, you want to make sure you send them over Dropbox or Google Drive or AirDrop so the original file is intact and no compression is happening during the transfer of the images. So now we're on to the final reason your photos are not sharp. And I know we've gone over a lot today. Stick with me. This one's important and it's going to tie everything in together. And I feel like this tie-in is the missing link to all these YouTube videos about sharpness. Now, the final reason your photos are not sharp is because your photos lack dynamic lighting. Now, at the end of the day, sharpness is simply the contrast between highlight details and shadow details. And the way you achieve more contrast in these details is by having lighting that is dynamic and strong. So a situation like this, where we have a bright external light source, is great for that. That's why product photographers love external light so much. Portrait photographers love to shoot at golden hour for the same reason. You have an angular light creating a lot of contrast between the shadow details and highlight details, creating a sharper image. So if you want sharper photos, pay attention to the light that is present and make sure you optimize that light to the best of your ability to get the sharpest photo possible. But the key point here is understanding that not every situation is going to be perfect. You're not always going to have the perfect lighting. Sharpness at the end of the day is a spectrum, and that is the key point I want you to understand from this video, and it's what I feel is missing from all the other videos. Not every scenario is going to be the perfect sharpness optimization situation, meaning sometimes you might have crappy lighting, and if you have crappy lighting, you need to pay attention to all the other variables I listed in today's video. If you're in a situation where you have good lighting, you actually may be able to get away with slacking on some of the things in today's video. At the end of the day, if you want the perfect sharp photo, you have to assess every single thing in this video and apply it. But it's rare to find yourself in that situation. So as a photographer, use your brain, be cerebral. It's something I've talked about throughout this entire video. Assess the situation you're in and figure out which variable in today's video is most important to give you the result you're looking for. If you're someone who has no control over the light that you're using, maybe try to use a lens that is more optimal for that situation. Use a prime lens on an overcast day versus a zoom lens to get that extra bit of sharpness. Maybe you're in a situation where you would love to use an aperture of f4 or f8, but it's going to drop your shutter speed too low and you don't want to boost your ISO. Bring your aperture down and pay attention to your focus so you still have a sharp, clean image and you have your other settings optimized. I know this is confusing, but that was kind of my goal with this video, to give a broad breakdown of sharpness and help you understand that it's not just one thing, it's everything combined together in this video and how they all come together, and how it's your job as a photographer to figure out which of these variables are present and which ones you have control over. But there we go, everything you have to know about sharpness in one video. If you want to support the channel, you can do a couple things for me. If you like my editing style, you can check out my presets on evanramp.com. I have a really cool preset system that's not the typical one size fits all, so if you watch more of these videos, you'll be able to see the formulas for how edits are made, just like in this video, in future videos, and on my Instagram and other social media, so you can get a real accurate representation of how to emulate my editing style in a variety of different situations. I wanted to make this something that had real long-term value for the people who are using it, so if you're interested, evanramp.com, it's linked in the description down below, or if you want to learn how I took my photography and turned it into a profitable business, you can go to moderncreativemoney.com, check out my course there, or you can just hit the thumbs up button and subscribe. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you in the next one.